Right, good morning everyone. I'm Jonathan Swan at Operis and welcome to this webinar on range names. You join us today here in London, very hot. I think the main topic of conversation is the swapping of war stories about travelling in public transport. It's a very hot and humid day here. But we're going to take time then to spend a few minutes going through the issue of range names and their use in Excel formulas. It's a short session and we're using the Zoom webinar software. At the bottom of your screen there's a toolbar. You may need to jiggle your mouse to see it, and your interaction with me unfortunately is limited to raising your hand, and then you can ask a question. When you raise your hand, what we see at this end is a little box. My colleague Jack Clark is sat next to me monitoring this, so if you do have questions, raise your hand and Jack will interact with you and feed the question through to me or your comments through to me. But other than that, it's a sort of passive exercise and just following the discussion. What we're going to be talking about is range names. Now, Operis is well positioned to talk about range names because we have quite a reputation as an exemplar of the use of range names. A brief background to the firm, of course, we're well established in the financial modelling space. We've been around for 25 years or so, and we started out originally as model developers, but over the last decade or so, the focus has shifted much more towards model audit and the provision of advisory service on the back of that. So we've been engaged in the discussion, the debate over range names throughout that time. And my role for the last 2 decades has been to head up the training side of the business, and perhaps more so than any of my colleagues, I go out and talk to people on my training courses because they're all based around the use of range names, and it's me that tends to bear the flak from the people who are resistant to their use, or in fact in many cases opposed to their use. So what we're going to do in this session is share with you some of the ideas that we've encountered over the years, both for and against the use of range names. Not to convince you either way, but as we always say on my training courses and elsewhere, it's part of your modelling toolkit. There's a right way of doing it, there's a wrong way of doing it, and there's a right time for doing it. And so it's I think for the knowledgeable and professional modeller, it's something you'll be interested in, that you should have an opinion about. But also be sensitive to the fact that there are, in various circumstances, people who are completely polarised against the use of range names completely. So in this session, then, I'm just going to take you through some of the major ideas. If my slide moves forward, there it goes. In essence, what are they? And I'm hoping you know a little bit about what they may be in the first place. But really, the purpose of this presentation is to consider what is the debate. Why is there a debate? These are techniques that we can use very easily in Excel, but we don't see it widely used, or as widely used as we might expect. So what I've got is a couple of spreadsheets set up, one that has range names and one that doesn't have range names, just to explore then what the basic ideas are. We talk about range names primarily in the context of formulas. So if I can find the model without range names here. This is based on one of my training models for simplicity, and it's really just to consider what the issues are using names in formulas. Now remember, a lot of people will accept that range names are great for naming objects, naming spaces within Excel, and also for use in things like Visual Basic macros and so forth. And that's fine. But we're looking at their use in formulas specifically. And the basic idea, if I go right back to the starting point, the thing that we all know when we first picked up Excel, perhaps many times now at school, or similar environments, we learn about writing calculations immediately using the idea of the cell reference. And in this particular example, I'm just pressing F2 there to examine a formula. By the way, I'm going to use a few shortcuts, and Jack is poised there at the keyboard. So as I do the shortcut, he'll probably type it up as a little chat window for you, just in case you didn't catch it or weren't familiar with it. I do hope you know F2, and if you don't, I've got a separate webinar that I do on formula inspection techniques in Excel that you can sign up for, and I take you through a whole series of these formula interaction methods. But this one then is basically F2, look at a form that's already written for me, and it says inputs D5. Immediately I can extract the information from reading that it's pointing to the input sheet. And this sheet I'm on happens to be a working sheet which follows normal Operis layout, and we have an input sheet behind it. and inputs then D5, very specific column and row reference. And so theoretically then the question, well, there is no question, is there? We know specifically what we're looking at. Very easy to track it back through. So if I just flip back to the input sheet and inspect cell D5, I see, yes, it's a cell that has an inflation rate for the period of 2019. That's pretty good, I think. It works for me. But the trouble I have with that, at a primary level, is that the formula itself doesn't tell me what it's actually linking to. It's got a coordinate, and in many ways it's like entering in somebody's postcode or address into a sat-nav system. You can plug in CM14HF to come and see me at my home, but until you start driving, you have absolutely no idea where you're going. And that's what we have here. It is a pointer. It indicates where we should be looking, but it's not providing information about what it is. And naturally, of course, the instant reaction is, of course, the whole thing is labelled. You can see it's a link, it's a reference to something called inflation rate, and therefore it's unlikely to be anything other than an inflation rate. And again, at this superficial level, this introductory level, then that in many cases is correct. If we look at some other formulas, I've got a calculation a bit further down for revenue, a nice simple thing to look at here. Same thing, I'm just pressing F2 to examine it. And good old Excel points at the precedent cells in this case, and it's identifying D17 and D12. And again, from context, I can read quite confidently that it's the annual production times the oil price in nominal terms. But that's required me again to read around it and to be able, in this case, to see the two precedent cells referred to in the formula. Again, trivial. I mean, the room for debate here is absolutely negligible. Repeating it once more, perhaps for a little bit further down the screen now, I've got the total costs. You can see where this is going. It's just pointing at cells. It's not hard to read what that formula is doing, and the formula hasn't really increased in complexity. If I go a bit further down, I think it's row 89, there we go. Something that's quite critical to this model then is the idea of the project cash flow. And you don't need to worry about what the model is actually doing, but it is a fairly standard line I'd expect to see in a lot of models that cross our desks here at Operis. But the idea then of the project cash flow expressed in nominal terms, and this time when I press F2 to examine the formula, I'm left in a bit more of an ambiguous position. I don't know how attentive you were in the last few minutes, but D19, you might recall, was the revenue cell that I was looking at. And D35 was that operating cost cell I had a very brief look at. But I'm not sure of D50, D72 or D150. So I've got the revenue cost part of the formula, but I'm not sure then, and I can't see on screen either, the D50, D72, D150. It's not a wide range dimension that's covered in those formulas, but the fact they're off screen brings in an element of ambiguity as to what is being referred to, and it requires me then, instead of just reading confidently that that is a project cash flow formula, it puts the responsibility on me just to confirm that those references are correct in the context of this formula. And again, formula inspection techniques, that's a matter of a moment or two's work, and again, a couple of nice keyboard shortcuts to assist me with that. But with the discussion here of range names, this is just sowing that seed of doubt and trying to establish, perhaps, is there a better way of going about writing these types of formulas? And again, this is a simple formula. It's a simple A minus B minus C minus D minus E formula, but I don't know what the elements of the formula actually are. A final point before I go into the range name is to flip through to one of the output sheets. And I'm going to go to the cash flow, again, because we're very familiar with cash flows. We do a lot of work with them. And it's neatly laid out, sensibly laid out with this direct cash flow structure. And again, plugging shamelessly, we have another webinar coming up shortly on the merits of the direct versus the indirect cash flow. So perhaps speak to Jack and sign up for that one too. But on this direct cash flow, revenue and costs, formulas that we've just seen on the working sheet, and in this case the formulas then reading correctly, workings D19, yes, we were looking at the working sheet, and yes, we were looking at D19. But eventually this memory game becomes rather overwhelming. Again, we spotted the D35, yes, we covered that. But this line labelled as working capital change, we haven't seen that yet, nor have we seen the others. And it's an unfortunate fact. But a lot of the operational type research that's been carried out in areas in spreadsheets, which is a separate topic and well worth investigating. But the use of the wrong cell reference is identified as one of the most common errors encountered in both modelling and in routine spreadsheet use. And we're opening ourselves up easily to that because we have these formulas now that are a fair level of remove from the element to which they refer. So I'm looking now at workings D72. I've never encountered workings D72. It could be D73, it could be D70. I don't know what it is. I have to go and investigate that cell reference and the context of that cell reference. And so a casual inspection of these formulas is becoming more and more difficult because it does require then a bit more investigation to confirm that these references are valid and correct in what they're trying to do. So what I'm going to do, I just flick back to the working sheet and back to the top of the working sheet. The model that I've been using here without the range names has all the formatting shown in green. I'm about to flick through to another model then that is exactly the same layout, but it has the range names included now and it's in gold. So just to make sure that the green one is without the range names and the gold one is with range names, just in case you don't see me flicking from one screen to the next. So same things, I'll just repeat exactly what I just walked through. So the starting point then is, in this case, an examination of the first link form as we would describe it. And now it's much more explicit as to what it's referring to. It's specifically an inflation rate. And we, in our name convention that I'll talk about towards the end of this presentation, we add the suffix in. That's one of the conventions that we follow. So that's a description then of an input inflation rate value. Previously, remember, it was a very simple formula. I think it's inputs D5 or something similar to that, which was easy to both read and to track back. But this time, I don't want to do the tracking back. I just want to inspect the form and be content that it's referring to something sensible and in relation to the formulas around it. Similarly, if I jump down to the revenue formula, again, in D19, we know that one now. But when I read the formula this time, it's, again, clearer that it's the annual production times the oil price nominal. And again, the exact nuances of the name itself there, the convention we use, we'll discuss shortly. But again, we're driving towards this issue then of being able to read a formula and understand it without necessarily being able to see the precedents. Well, again, this is such a trivial formula, following on from the previous demonstration, that we can easily see the precedents in this case as well. And again, I think you can see where we're going to go with this. If I go to the total cost formula towards the bottom there, same thing, I'm pressing F2, and again I can read clearly what is being added up, and in this case I can happen to see what's being added up to, but it's adding up in each case the nominal costs. Noting then in passing that we also have for each category a real terms cost. Now with a cell reference formula, that might not have been so apparent. But in this case, it's very clear that this formula is deliberately adding up the nominal costs in each category. So let's go and look at that other formula, then the cash flow formula, that I think is probably a bit more interesting, because that, remember, covered a bit more of the real estate of this particular spreadsheet. And when I hit F2 this time, you can see suddenly the whole formula jumps into life. I can read it immediately: revenue, costs, working capital, capex, and tax. And I can instantly map that against my own expectation of what a project cash flow formula should read. I don't need to interpret it. I don't need to break it down and locate the precedent cells, which could be very widely scattered throughout a large model. In this case, we don't need to concern ourselves at all about the gaps between these, the distance covered between revenue and tax paid. It's irrelevant. It's simply here the statement that this formula is revenue, cost, working capital, capex, and tax. And I think that brings in the value of what we're trying to reach with range names. Again, just going to the output to consider the benefits from this. The row heading says revenue, and astonishingly, the formula says revenue. So again, going to our name conventions later on, this is something we're trying to seek. The formula there says operating costs, slight change in language there, cost total. This formula is working capital change. The formula says working capital change. So in the output level, I'm now driving towards the fact that the outputs themselves are providing the assurance that they are pointing at the right thing. And it's going to be very hard, I would imagine, to misinterpret or to indeed put in the wrong description here. It says tax paid and the formula says tax incurred, then that ain't right. And the language itself then guides me into the correction that may be required, or the check that may be required to assure myself about what's been achieved with the formula. So we're trying then to think about range names then as providing more insight into the formula. We've still got the formula inspection techniques. We can still go behind tax paid or whatever it may be to satisfy ourselves about the underlying calculations. But at this top level, we can just glance at the formula and understand what it's doing, and in this case, validate, approve what it's trying to tell us. So what is the debate then? Where does the real argument come from? And it is quite a heated argument, I can assure you of that, having taught this for many, many years and been to conferences and stuff. If I go back to my PowerPoint, I think I've got another slide here. Yes, blank slide. Oops, one too many. Sorry, I deleted that slide. The issue that we would raise is that, there's one group in particular I'm happy to name them, the FAST group, FAST Alliance, and they are, I won't say vehemently opposed to range names, but it's something that they really don't like, and they actively discourage people from using. And having spoken to the authors of the FAST standard, the argument they use is a valid argument. I fully accept it. If I go back to my cell reference model for a moment, the argument from FAST, if I just pick this inflation index formula, it's not a complex formula there, it's the previous cell times 1 plus the inflation rate. But the FAST argument, which is probably the most well expressed of the arguments in opposition to range names, is that it's the lowest common denominator approach. Anybody who's ever done anything with spreadsheets will have been taught to write formulas using cell references. And so you could show this to a colleague who's got nothing to do with spreadsheets in their routine work, but they've done a spreadsheet course at some point, they know what to do. So when they examine a formula like this, C6 times 1 plus D5, they can work out what it means. No matter how complex we then make the formula and how wide the area is that the formula describes, the novice user or the person who doesn't use spreadsheets that much can still understand or attempt to understand what the formula is doing. And that's then described as the lowest common denominator approach. There are no barriers to reading any of the formulas. Everything can be inspected, and everything at whatever level can be taken back using the cell reference approach to the precedents that drove the whole thing. So again, I don't need to show further formulas to illustrate the point, but that's what they're striving to achieve. Here at Operis, we agree with that. It's a starting point, by all means. But we think that when you're moving into modelling, and if I can use the expressions loosely, using the American education system, but we think that the cell reference approach is your spreadsheet 101 course. It just gives you the grounding to do the calculations to get you started. We like to think that when you're into modelling as opposed to spreadsheets, and we do make a distinction, that you're up to spreadsheets 301, the third year of your studies, and you should have more skills. You've got more insights into what models are about, how to use them, what the problems are, what the issues can be. And so we use the expression natural language formula to describe the benefit that we seek from the range name. So I just flick through to my spreadsheet. The benefit we derive here with my project cash flow formula, I'm just sticking with a couple of formulas. I don't want to fire up too many to overwhelm. But in this case, you can see very simply natural language formula. That there's nothing particular encoded here. There's no refined language. There's no obscure language. This is natural language. I could go, if I could use the UK example, my junior colleagues, I've got a batch of them starting today, we tend to throw a copy of Breulin-Myers' Principles of Corporate Finance at them. And I think it's still section 3 is the discounted cash flow. And in there, the worthy professors, Breulin-Myers and Marcus, describe the project cash flow in terms of revenue, costs, working capital, capex, and tax. And so it's the language that is being used when we talk to each other, when we talk to clients. This is exactly the language that we would be throwing around to describe the elements of the model that we need to work on. The cell reference approach, of course, is then specific to that particular model. So let's look at the equivalent then in the non-range name model. Again, F2 on that one. The formula then is readable. We can, again, trace the precedents. We can easily find them, but they are then specific in the context of that model. They're not generic. And if I was then look at a similar model, I would then look at the same formula, project cash flow nominal returns, but the references themselves would, by definition, be different. With the Operis approach, the range name approach, we generally find that you can go from one model to the next and the range names will be the same, if not identical, in many cases. And again, talking about name conventions very shortly, there are many issues attached to that add a huge amount of benefit, particularly when you're doing a team-based approach to your modelling work. So we're trying to move away then from just the lowest common denominator approach, which we can always revert back to. That's the beauty of this approach. It's not didactic and saying this is the way it must be. We can then deal with the fact that client may throw in some opposition to this. They may want to use their model with a less experienced set of users, so we can take the names out. We can always revert back to that. But we think there's a level of sophistication about using the range names. And as a natural language formulas, bring in this idea that you're now literate rather than numerate. And therefore, most people are generally more literate. They can read things more quickly and understand things in verbal terms rather than understanding the coding of the cell reference and the decoding of a formula. And so that's what we're striving for, and we like to think that the professional modelers will be able to select the appropriate tool to use for the appropriate audience. We would strive, and we do in the models that we produce for our clients, we will use these range names consistently and reliably and with a huge amount of comfort, because a lot of these things are just repeated from one model to the next. And the benefit there is that the people involved in our quality assurance cycle, who are not going to write the formulas themselves, but perhaps doing the first level of peer review and then more senior levels of review where they're looking at other people's spreadsheets from a very high level for audit purposes, they can read these formulas and they're very understandable. And again, thinking this is a trivial model, but thinking about some of the loan agreements, the banking agreements and so forth, the language there can be related back to the contracts and agreements very, very easily. And so that's, again, a major plus for us. So we would encourage the use of range names. I'm not in this session going to, unless anyone particularly wants to, I'm not going to concern myself too much about the range name techniques. It's what we're really talking about is the use of the range names. So if I can pick up on our name conventions at this stage, again, to try and show how we would go about in a large model doing these. The first thing that you'll note is that we have the left-hand side of the page. Now, this is a very short model in terms of its forecast period, but this applies equally to my P3 models that are 100 columns wide. We have the narrative, as we describe it, down the left-hand side of the page, and that's what you get in both styles of modeling. So you're always going to have these labels in place. You're always going to have descriptions for each row. And again, going back to our friends at the FAST methodology, that's part of their basis. They want unique names for each row. Well, we prefer to use the approach here of using a section heading followed by a series of subheadings as required. So each line does have a description, but these descriptions often repeat. So I can see these brought forward, carry forward structures popping out all over the place, which means on a line by line basis, the narrative would be duplicated if I was attempting to use these as range names. So what you can see, and that's why I've chosen this particular model to demonstrate to you, is on one screen we can see the corresponding range name has been set up over on the right-hand side of the range. And the point from that then is each range is documented. There's no ambiguity. So when I say we can track back the thing called revenue, well, when we do track back revenue, we discover that not only is the row heading revenue, but the range name is revenue. So we've got that correspondence. So most of the time there is a close correspondence, in this case identical correspondence. In other cases we just need to add a little bit extra. And generally what we try and achieve here is a category name, and that's derived, as you see, ultimately from the section heading. So I've got production. I don't need to put oil in there. I have put oil price in these. So the section heading comes first, the section description, and then the subheading is then captured in the second part of the name. And the other thing you'll notice if you glance at our use of range names here is that we type them as compound words. There's no particular issue with that. There is one American author who recommends the use of underscore characters to separate the words in the range names, but we find our approach works just as well. And indeed, we see this type of name writing, if I can describe it as that, is the same style that's used often by the programmers in their Visual Basic and in other circumstances. So we try and derive as natural names as we possibly can, based on then the first element of the name being the category and then the description that follows. And you can see that's been consistently followed as we go down through the right-hand edge of the spreadsheet then. So as we get more and more depth into the spreadsheet, in each case we can see easily what we're trying to achieve here and relate it back to the corresponding row heading for navigation purposes. The benefits again are that if I were to go through into our big analysts room next door, where we've got 30-odd analysts all ploughing away at doing different bits of spreadsheet work and modelling work, we have a standard vocabulary. Here at Operis we don't write it down. We did many years ago have it written down, but generally the language is so consistent across all the teams here, and including our Canadian office, of course, that it's very easy for us to write this type of code very quickly, and for colleagues then to be able to read it quickly and understand it, and of course check it. Error checking is still part of our work, and so it's very easy to test. And again, because you're not writing code, then reading, there's a nice monster of a formula here, you can read that and generally untangle what it's trying to do. If that was the cell reference equivalent, and I won't trouble you with it, it could be a bit harder to work out what the thing is trying to achieve. But the language there instantly gives you an insight into what we're using. And I think that in many cases is the strongest argument. People are more confident with reading words than they are then with looking at the code. But as we accept, if I go and look at that dividends formula again, here, there it is. Okay, the elements do go off screen, but we have to accept, and the lowest common denominator approach is that any novice or other user can pick up this and unpick that formula. There is an argument then that looking at the range name version of this, there's a bit of a barrier here because some people don't know how to work with the range names. I'll conclude technically with the idea of any time I press F2 to look at these names, you can see that the name refers to the entire range. The whole line lights up. With the cell reference version, if I just drop out, of course, it's pointing at specific cells. So you know exactly in each case here that all of these elements are in column D, and that's where your review of precedence would take place. So how does that relate to what we're trying to achieve with range names? And this is a very common critique I have, and there's one further one I'll finish off with. But what we learn from Excel is that when you name a range, as we have here, there is no ambiguity about which column is being described, because the way that Excel works with the range names, it looks for the intersection of the formula column, in this case column D, with the horizontally named range. So it looks vertically up and down the column to find the intersection with the named range. So again, although net cash brought forward off screen is, in this case, 10 cells wide, there is only one intersection with column D. And so similarly, as we go down the row there, interest net, for example, in this formula would still be the column D interest net. So there's no ambiguity as far as Excel is concerned. And that, in our opinion, is a safety mechanism. It's pinned down on the idea of left-to-right consistency of formula writing, which we can talk about in a separate presentation. But it's very reliable and very open to understanding formulas very rapidly, because it's the same formula across the whole row. The final point I would make in terms of the discussion about range names is usually at the end of day one of my courses, whichever course I'm teaching, we're going to start out with range names. And somebody will then throw down their pencil and say, Jonathan, I've now got 50 range names. How am I supposed to remember them all? And it's usually said with a little bit of passion as well. I don't know. I don't know how you'd remember them all. The question I would then counter with is, why would you? Why would you need to remember? It goes exactly back to my point a few moments ago, that these range names are the mirror of the row headings. So if you're doing a calculation with, I'm just pointing at senior debt here, then the range names will have something to do with senior debt. And indeed, that's precisely what we find if we look at the formulas. Okay. So there's no need to memorize hundreds, thousands of range names. The range names are descriptive. And again, Even if you were a cell reference user, just look at that formula there. My senior closing balance there is the opening balance plus the change. If I was describing this to somebody who didn't want to use range names, I go back to my non-name model, I would tell them, take the opening balance and add the change. Well, they have to interpret that and convert it into cell references. But in my range name model, I can use exactly that language. Take the opening balance and add the signature and add the change. So I think people try and build barriers in their use of range names. We tend to find in most organizations that you do need a critical mass. I've been involved in this for many organizations over the years. If you come on one of my courses and you're only one of your team doing it, you will go away buzzing after 2 days or 4 days, depends how long you spend with me. You'll be buzzing about the use of range names. You go back and you start showing this to your colleagues and you'll hit the brick wall. And very soon you'll find yourself going back to cell references simply to fit in. It's only really when there's a critical mass of colleagues who are all engaged in this, who see what the true benefits are here, the benefits of natural language formulas, the benefits of the few extra moments it takes to set up the range names. And again, I'll do a separate keyboard shortcut presentation of this. But it doesn't take very long, and the benefits, as I said, then you're going to talk to your colleagues about how do I solve this problem. You discuss it using natural language, and then you take that natural language and you convert it into formulas to reflect exactly what the discussion suggested to you. So we think there's many recommendations for the use of range names in your model, but there's always the issue then that you can always go back to cell references. So we're not suggesting for one moment this is the only way of writing formulas or the best way of writing formulas, but for you as professional modelers, consider the arguments. I'm hoping you wouldn't do it as we often encounter as a knee-jerk rejection of the whole idea, but do enter into the debate, engage with it, understand what the issues are. We think as a firm, and we get paid to do this commercially by our clients, we think the value that they add to our work far outweighs the apparent nuisance of having to set up names for every single line of code that you write. It's the trade-off you need to consider, particularly we find if models are going to be used by other people. The idea of self-documenting formulas, natural language formulas that are easy to inspect, and once the shock of seeing a formula expressed in this way, rather than the cell references, once that shock has been dealt with, then models like this, no matter how complex overall, on a line-by-line basis, become very, very easy to understand and engage with. So that's really all I wanted to talk about. I didn't, as I said, want to talk about the techniques for setting up range names, but I do hope you've found that of interest to at least be aware that there is a considerable discussion about the topic of range names, perhaps more than anything else that we encounter in modelling. And there is, of course, no right answer. It's what works for you, and if you're confident and understanding what the range names are, then it will enhance your work, we believe. But if you're not confident and you prefer the old way of working with cell references, absolutely fine. You're not wrong, there's no issue. But at least you've now got an insight, I hope, into what they might do for you in the future. So, has Jack got any questions coming through? I'll invite questions or comments at this stage. Please just click on the, jiggle your mouse, that will bring the toolbar up at the bottom of the screen there, or at the top of the screen. And from there you can click on raise hand, and we can then see if you have any comments. Anything coming through, Jack? Okay. All right. Well, I'll start moving to the conclusion. If you want to know more about any of the range name material or anything else, do speak to Jack. We have other material that takes you into great depth in the use and application of range names, because we use them in all of our training courses. We have the Project Finance Methodology and Techniques and Project Finance Extended, which we often run together as a combined course, because they follow naturally on from one from the other. 2 days of methodology and techniques, which sets out how to use range names, and then followed by 2 days of extended techniques. Also, if you're not into the building of the spreadsheets, but to look at spreadsheets, we have this assessing and interrogating financial models, which doesn't really push the idea of range names in the same way. They are used in a couple of examples, but that's more about looking at spreadsheets from a more generic perspective. We also have software, and our Oak Operis Analysis Kit software has a number of tools relating to the range names. So that's well worth being aware of how that could assist you. And of course, we're now well into our program of webinars, so sign up for that and we'll keep you updated with further topics. I think the next one, early next month, is the one on contracts. So it's more of a theoretical aspect. It's the issue of contracts and particularly direct and indirect cash flow and their use in that context. Nothing coming through, Jack? Okay, well, thank you all for attending, and please, after the course, send Jack an email or send me an email if you have any specific questions. I'd be delighted to follow up. Thank you for your attention this morning, and we'll finish there. Thank you.